Okay, it's time to get back down to business. We're sufficiently late, so now we can get going. Um, the next speaker is Steve Nadler. He's professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the title of his paper is The Order of Nature and Moral Luck, Maimonides on Divine Providence.
Thank you. And my thanks to Eric for the invitation to come out here and the respite from what's been a long and very tedious Wisconsin winter. Just to give you a sense of that, I got an email this morning. Fred says that if we don't get snow mixing with rain tonight before the precipitation ends, we will be playing hockey on the lake tomorrow. It's March, for goodness sakes. Does everybody have a copy of the handout? Good. There are a number of different problems that all fall under the topic of divine providence in medieval and early modern philosophy. There is the question of why God would create something distinct from itself in the first place. If God is infinite and perfectly self-sufficient, what could possibly motivate God to create? Leibniz, for one, tried to fit the act of divine creation into a system ruled by the principle of sufficient reason, and show how the creation of the world must have been motivated by some reasons that even God found compelling. His contemporary, Malebranche, countered that if the act of divine creation of the universe is a completely unmotivated event. Malebranche's God is not at all moved by any reasons to create anything outside itself. Thus, if God does create, it is an arbitrary act. Another problem that roughly falls under the topic of divine providence is the question of divine foreknowledge and its apparent tension with the robust conception of human freedom. How does God have knowledge of future contingents? Moreover, assuming that an omniscient God does know that a subset of future contingent events that consist in human free choices, and if God's knowledge of those events is necessarily infallible, then God knows from eternity that an individual will make a particular choice at a particular point in time. But this means that this person at that specified moment in time cannot choose other than as he or she does and as God knows they would. Otherwise, God's eternal knowledge would not be absolutely certain. In what sense, then, is the choice a free one? As interesting and important as these questions they are, and they received a good deal of attention from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim philosophers in the Middle Ages, they're not the subject of my talk today. Rather, what I want to focus on is that subset of questions under the topic of divine providence that make up the so-called problem of evil. That is, why is there sin, suffering, and imperfection in a world created by an omnipotent, omniscient, wise, and just God? Why do the virtuous suffer while the wicked prosper? Why do Republicans become governors of Midwestern states? I couldn't help myself there. The problem of evil, there is no God apparently. The problem of evil, of course, finds its earliest presentation in Jewish literature in the book of Job. We are told in the story's prologue that Job is a blameless and upright man, Tam v'yashar, that he fears God and turns away from wrongdoing. When Job's tribulations begin, he accepts them unshaken in his faith and unwilling to speak ill of God. Ultimately, however, it is all too much even for him. When Job is finally overcome by his suffering, when he has been robbed of everything that was dear to him, when all seems lost, he raises his voice to complain to God about the way he, a righteous individual, has been treated. While Job recognizes God's wisdom and power, he nonetheless questions God's justice. God, he insists, rains blows on me without cause. He destroys the blameless and wicked alike. From the perspective of theodicy, the book of Job ends on an ambiguous and ultimately unsatisfying note. Elihu's speech, after the other friends are done with their cold comfort, seems at first to represent a supreme defense of God's justice, a justice in fact couched in simple, comprehensible, and even human terms. Elihu says, "Far be it from God to do evil, or the Almighty to play false, for he pays a man according to his work, and sees that he gets what his conduct deserves. The truth is, God does no wrong, and the Almighty does not pervert justice." And yet, Elihu ends by appealing to God's metaphysical and epistemological transcendence, and, by implication, the inscrutability of God's ways. God is so great that we cannot know him, he says. One must have faith that God is just, but with a justice that is beyond our understanding, and such that God cannot be called to account. And God's final speech in Job seems only to confirm these sentiments. After pointing out the majesty and wonder of creation and the ultimate mystery and incomprehensibility of the world, God puts a simple end to the discussion. Can you deny that I am just or put me in the wrong that you may be right? God is just, the book seems to conclude, but with a justice that cannot be explained in terms drawn from human justice. Despite this final anti-rationalism about divine justice, the book of Job was the spur for a long rationalist tradition in Jewish thought on the problem of evil. This is the tradition I want to focus on here. In particular, I'd like to look at a particularly interesting ambiguity in the theodicy of that greatest of all Jewish philosophers, Maimonides. It's an ambiguity and a puzzle that has troubled commentators ever since Maimonides' own time. Rationalist Jewish philosophers, just because of their rationalism, faced a particular challenge when approaching the problem of evil. On the one hand, they were committed to the idea that the problem does have an answer, that the humble skepticism of fideism that closes the book of Job is not the last word on the matter. An explanation can indeed be given for the suffering of the virtuous and the prosperity of the vicious. There are accessible reasons why bad things happen to good people and good things to bad people. It's something we can understand. On the other hand, not even the most convinced rationalist of the medieval period was willing to say that God's reasons are completely transparent to human understanding, that we can know the deepest secrets of divine wisdom and find therein the Theodician answer we seek. It would take a Spinoza to even contemplate making such a bold claim. Another factor is the rationalist's need to avoid the anthropomorphization of God. Maimonides, Gersonides, and others were all concerned to explain divine providence without resorting to the portrayal of God as a personal agent, one who regards each particular situation in its particularity and engages in the distribution of reward and punishment in a human-like way, fending off dangers from the righteous and hurling thunderbolts upon the vicious. This overall attitude is well captured by Maimonides' approach to the problem of evil. He argued, of course, strenuously against the anthropomorphization of God. Nor did he think that God's wisdom was perfectly accessible to finite minds and that the resolution of the problem is to be found in such supreme access. But Maimonides did insist that we can indeed understand why bad things happen to good people and why the distribution of goods and evils in this world and in the world to come, as unjust as it may appear, is as it is. As I shall show, however, the problem is it's not quite clear how we are to read Maimonides' account. In particular, I want to look at what we are supposed to do with one very puzzling, very odd passage from the Guide of the Perplexed, a passage that other commentators have seemed all too willing to write off as not to be taken seriously. I will argue, in fact, that in the passage in question, Maimonides means pretty much what he says. First, some background. Maimonides' preferred solution to the problem of evil involves what might be called the consider the whole strategy. According to the consider the whole strategy, any concerns about divine justice generated by evil in the world are due to one's having adopted too narrow a focus. For example, by looking only at certain features of the world and not others. One can therefore alleviate those concerns by broadening one's perspective and considering more or different aspects of creation. One will then see, with this broader perspective, one will then see that the world is, on the whole, good. And this strategy can take two forms, depending upon just how one is supposed to broaden one's perspective and regard the world holistically. One variety asks for a quantitative expansion of vision, and the other requires a qualitative reorientation. Maimonides initially takes up the Theodician challenge by responding to the complaint that the species of evil are ubiquitous. He responds that the world created by God is that is the complaint that the world created by God is predominantly bad, and that there are more evils in the world than there are good things. And understood in this way, the problem of evil is a quantitative problem, and thus its solution is to be found in a proper reckoning of the number of good things versus the number of evil things. Consider the whole on this reading means look at a greater sampling of the world's phenomena, and you will see that, as a matter of fact, the premise of the complaint is false, and the number of good things is greater than the number of evil things. Thus, Maimonides argues that a true accounting reveals that physical evils and moral evils, the evils that happen to us through the course of nature and the evils that we perform upon each other, do not occur as often as the multitude believe. You will find cities existing for thousands of years that have never been flooded or burned, and thousands of people are born in perfect health, whereas the birth of an infirm human being, he says, is an anomaly, or at least such an individual is very rare. Similarly, with respect to the evils that we inflict upon one another, he argues that while they may be more numerous than the physical evils that happen naturally, they nonetheless, he says, do not form the majority of occurrences upon the earth taken as a whole. Rather, they become common only in extreme circumstances, such as war. While this version of the consider the whole strategy could, in theory, afford a reply to the charge that the world created by God is predominantly evil, and that the bad things outnumber the good, it's ultimately an unsatisfying theodicy. First, it can lead to a potentially unresolvable numbers game, with endless disputes about how many good things there are versus how many bad things there are, fueled by disagreements about which things are in fact good and which are bad. Second, even if the quantitative approach does answer the charge that the world is mostly evil, it leaves unanswered the primary question of the problem of evil: why is there any evil at all in a world created by a wise, benevolent, and all-powerful God? Thus, we turn to the qualitative version of the consider the whole strategy, also offered by Maimonides. It's not concerned with the relative quantities of good and evil things. Rather, on this version, the broadening of perspective demanded is either a kind of utilitarian or aesthetic consideration of the contribution that evils make to the overall goodness of the world, or at least an acknowledgement of the qualitative and not merely quantitative insignificance of the evils that plague human beings. Like Leibniz's theodicy 500 years later, which points to the necessary role that various evils play in making this the best of all possible worlds, Maimonides asks us to look more broadly at the universe as the overall context in which human sin and suffering occur. What we will then see is the wisdom manifest in that which exists, and the excellence and the true reality of the whole, including the contribution that the so-called evils make to it. Moreover, when one moves beyond the narrow confines of human needs and desires and expands one's vision to take in the spheres of the heavens and the separate intellects related to them, one will recognize that not everything exists for our own convenience. Thus, just because something is evil or inconvenient for a human being, or even for human beings generally, and regardless of how often it occurs, it does not follow that it holds any significance for the overall qualitative determination of the character of the world. Dropping the anthropocentric perspective will relieve one of the urge to complain that God's creation is evil, and will do so without the problematic numbers game generated by the quantitative version of this strategy. Thus, Maimonides' general Theodician strategy is a consider the whole strategy. But there's still one question left unanswered by this strategy in both of its versions, namely the central question of the problem of evil. Why do virtuous people sometimes suffer, and why do wicked people seem so often to prosper? In order to be satisfied that such phenomena are compatible with divine justice, One wants to know more than simply that such things do not